Hello, everyone. This is Manisha Sinha. I am the Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut and a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University for the year. I'm here today on behalf of the Westport Museum of History and Culture to talk about my book, The Slave's Cause. Um, this is the paperback version. It has a white cover. I think the hardcovers are all sold out, all 10,000 copies. So you will find the paperback version on Amazon and at Yale University Press website. And of course, you can also find the audiobooks and Kindle there if you are interested in the book. Um, so I wanted to share with you a little bit about why I wrote this book. I wanted to write a book about the abolition movement that would do justice to its history. I found that our views of the abolitionists were very thin. They were seen as these individual, religiously inspired men and women, mainly white in the North, who did not really have a first-hand experience of slavery, but who bravely took up the cause of slavery, of abolition of slavery, and that was the popular view. And in academia, abolitionists had for a long time been vilified as fanatics who believed in racial equality and in immediately ending slavery, as moral absolutists who threatened the union with slaveholders. That kind of caricature of the abolitionists changed during the civil rights movement when they were seen more as precursors to civil rights activists in a more heroic mold. But what you didn't get a sense of was the entire history of the movement. In fact, many historians saw abolitionists as relatively conservative, as sort of racially paternalistic, and not very radical in their views when it came to questions of the economy and other questions besides slavery. So when I started researching my book, 10 years ago, I decided I would first expand the way in which we looked at the abolition movement, go back to the 18th century, look at some of the pioneers in the first wave of abolition during the Revolutionary era, and go right up to the Civil War and look at the ways in which ordinary American citizens, men and women, black and white, participated in the movement. What I wanted to do was to sort of reimagine the abolition movement as a radical interracial social movement, one in which African Americans, both enslaved and free, played a central part. So these were not just Northern whites, participating in the movement, Northern middle class whites, though certainly there were many of them. But it also involved ordinary folk, particularly Black people themselves. So I tried to center slave resistance, instances of slave resistance, and look at the ways in which that fed into the abolition movement and radicalized the movement as a whole. Going back to the colonial era, you look at the early Quaker abolitionists, and you can really tell their history in tandem with the history of slave rebellions and runaways, and right up to the antebellum era, which we are more familiar with, the period just before the Civil War, in which many fugitive slaves, the most famous, of course, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, we have many books and movies on these figures. But I really wanted to uncover the story of some of the people whom we haven't heard about, ordinary people who made the movement, who radicalized the movement, both in its ideas, in terms of fighting not just against Southern slavery, but also for racial equality and citizenship in the North. I wanted to really see the ways in which they had fed into the ideas, the tactics of the movement. Then I am, of course, also interested in another aspect of abolition, and that was the ways in which it overlapped with contemporary radical movements. You could begin with utopian socialism. Louisa May Alcott, for instance, her father belonged to one of these communitarian societies in Massachusetts. You could look at pacifism, the first international peace movement. One could look at movements for Native American rights, for working class rights, and how all these sort of overlapped with abolition was important for me to uncover. I also looked at it in an international perspective, seeing the ways in which the abolition movement fed into movements criticizing European imperialism and warfare, certainly with pacifism, the ways in which many European immigrants who were involved in the 1848 Republican revolutions came to the United States and became part of this movement. So it was important for me to uncover the broader radicalism of the abolition movement and see the ways in which the slaves' cause was connected to many other causes at that point. So those were some of the original interventions that the book made, and it ends with really talking about the ways in which the abolition movement has fed into the march of American democracy, not as a linear process or unproblematic process, but as a contested one, and the ways in which abolitionists have contributed not just to the broader democratic project of the United States, but also to emancipation during the Civil War. Many times we see emancipation as just a result of a particular moment in the war, a military necessity. But in fact, the groundwork for that moment of Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation was set by this 100-year-long history of abolitionist activism on the ground, in the courtrooms, in the women's movement, in a whole other sort of other spheres of activism that fed into making emancipation a political issue during the war. So I was really interested in tracing the connections between anti-slavery politicians like Lincoln and the earlier abolitionist activist movements, but also the conversation that went on, of course, during the war over emancipation. So showing that abolition had a lot of political significance, that in fact it impacted the process of emancipation, and that its triumph during the Civil War and immediately after that, even though it seemed temporary, was actually a lasting contribution to the project of American democracy. So those are the sort of broad theoretical interventions that the book makes. But what I try to do in the book is talk a lot more about the stories of individual abolitionists and the ideas that they put forth. I try to recover them a bit in a narrative form. So the book, even though it is big, I believe is readable. And I will now try and read just a snippet from the book to give you just to convey a sense of how I have written this book, trying to make those broader arguments through a narrative, through the stories of individual abolitionists. And the section that I've chosen to read to you today is from the chapter on the woman question. You'll recall that I mentioned how the early women's movement really grew out of the abolition movement. Not all abolitionists were feminists, and the whole women's rights issue did create a schism, a division in the abolition movement, but most early feminists were abolitionists. And I think it is important to recover that history because we often forget that history when we talk about suffrage and the early women's movement. So here goes. Here's a bit from this chapter. And on one of those pioneering abolitionist feminists, a Black woman by the name of Maria Stewart, she was born in Connecticut. So she's a local state heroine like Prudence Crandall. And I just want to read a bit from this chapter about her and her life and contributions. So, women were abolition's most effective foot soldiers. The best answer to anti abolitionist violence came from Black and white women who marched arm in arm to shield each other from the howling mobs during the Boston riot in 1835 and in Pennsylvania Hall a few years later. As Angelina Grimke put it in a letter that caught her future husband, the abolitionist Theodore Wells' attention, if abolitionists had to pay with their blood for the oppression of a guilty nation, they were prepared to do it. So seminal were women's contributions, effect, and influence on abolition that Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina singled them out as women who, quote, unsexed themselves to carry on this horrid warfare against slaveholders. Female anti-slavery societies were some of the first founded, and women abolitionists emerged as leading orators, writers, and organizers of abolition. Now, African American women played a crucial part in the rise of militant Black abolitionism in the 1820s. Black women's abolitionism came of age in the writings and speeches of remarkable women like Maria Stewart, whom I'm going to be talking about today. Now, the abolitionist, the eminent abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, published Maria Stewart's innocuously titled Religion and the Pure Principles of Morality in 1831. Many years later, he recounted meeting her in the quote, flush and promise of a ripening womanhood. The beautiful, brilliant Stewart was one of the first American women to speak publicly. This is to speak in public audiences. Frances Wright, of course, who had spoken earlier than her, was British. She included an introductory sketch of herself in her book, her birth in Hartford, Connecticut in 1803, an orphan at the age of 5, bound to a clergyman's family, how her, quote, soul thirsted for knowledge, her education in Sabbath schools, her marriage at the age of 23 to the War of 1812 veteran James W. Stewart, and her widowhood 3 years later. Mentored by the Black abolitionist David Walker, who wrote The Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, a famous militant pamphlet of abolition, and befriended by the, quote, noble-hearted Garrison, she issued an early call to arms against, quote, slavery and ignorance. She asked, quote, ye daughters of Africa, to awake, arise, and distinguish yourselves. Stewart's message was not restricted to a plea for female education, though she did argue for that. She asked Blacks to, quote, promote and respect ourselves, to patronize each other, improve our own talents, and be silent no longer. The, quote, great and mighty men of America, slaveholders, the rich and powerful ones, may kill, tyrannize, and oppress, but they could not crush the, quote, fearless and undaunted spirits of the Africans forever. To Americans who acknowledge all the nations of the earth, except the Black Republic of Haiti, the first modern Black republic created by a slave rebellion, she emphasized, quote, we claim our rights. Stewart was soon lecturing before the New England Anti-Slavery Society and the African Masonic Lodge, the preeminent organization of Black men in Boston, to mixed audiences of Blacks and whites, men and women. She was hoodwinked of her inheritance on her husband's death, and she criticized, quote, prejudice, ignorance, and poverty for the plight of free Blacks in the North. As she argued, quote, continual and hard labor irritates our tempers and sours our dispositions. The whole system becomes worn out with toil and fatigue. While Stewart clarified that she did not think it, quote, derogatory for persons to live out to service, she resented the fact that, quote, most of our color have dragged out a miserable existence of servitude from cradle to the grave. She exhorted Black men to speak out, quote, in the defense of African rights and liberty, and to work for abolition. Let every man of color throughout the United States who possesses the spirit and principles of a man sign a petition to Congress to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia and grant you the rights and privileges of common free citizens. Her frequent admonitions against men's vices like dancing, drinking, and gambling at the cost of anti-slavery activism may have bothered some. On the eve of her departure from Boston, she justified her right to speak out. Quote, "What if I am a woman?" she asked, asserting that women were by turn martyrs, apostles, warriors, divines, and scholars. Well before the Grimke sisters, Stewart contended that neither sex nor race marked a person, but the quote, principle formed in the soul. She wrote a letter to the Reverend Alexander Crummell, and his letter on her behalf reveals that Stewart became a teacher when she left Boston in Williamsburg, and she was a member of the Colored Ladies Literary Society, and she attended the anti-slavery female convention in 1837. Crummell recalled meeting her, quote, "a young woman of my own people, full of literary aspiration and ambitious authorship." She moved to Baltimore in 1853 and then to Washington, where she ran a Sabbath school for Black children. She did not stop lecturing and publishing, as is commonly assumed by most historians. She delivered a suitably religious lecture on the proper training of children in 1860 and wrote a semi-autobiographical story on an orphaned Black girl. Stewart heard the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation just as President Lincoln issued it in 1863, and like many abolitionists, she became involved in freedmen's relief during the Civil War. When she finally received her husband's pension, she invested it in a new edition of her speeches in 1879, including a letter from Garrison reminiscing on their early collaboration in the abolition movement. They both died that year. Well, I hope you enjoyed the short reading from my book. I did want to talk about Stewart because I felt that we need to know so much more about these forgotten figures from the abolition movement. Now historians have increasingly uncovered their stories, and I hope my book contributed towards that. But they're really not that well known in the popular public imagination, and I think it is important for us to recover the real life stories and contributions that abolitionists have made to the American democratic project, to understand how ordinary citizens, in fact, can make a difference when it comes to political activism, to doing something in terms of bettering the world that we live in. I see I have some comments here, and I can see that I have very nice comments coming in here from Boston, Brooklyn, Washington, D.C. I'm glad that in this time of quarantine, shelter at home, that we have the opportunity to at least connect with each other virtually. The question here is, in terms of the sources for the book, um, I really did look at this vast archive that abolitionists have left us. They were not the most powerful people in antebellum America, but they had a huge print culture of pamphlets and newspapers, and they printed their speeches and they circulated it to the United States Postal Service, a constitutionally mandated government service that allowed them to spread their message, even though slaveholders, of course, were intent on burning abolitionist literature and interfering in the delivery of abolitionist literature through the United States Postal Service in the South. But abolitionists used whatever forms of communication they had. They lectured in churches. If they were not allowed to lecture in churches, they would go into sheds and farmyards and lecture there. And interestingly enough, African Americans, especially fugitive slaves like Frederick Douglass and many others, were in great demand in the abolitionist lecture circuit because they could speak from their firsthand experiences about slavery. They could actually refute slaveholders who were saying that slavery is a benign, benevolent institution in which they, quote, took care of their Black family. Of course, one does not enslave their family or make them work from dusk to dawn. But that was the idea that slaveholders were putting forth, that they were, in fact, benevolent, paternalistic masters. So, both in terms of oratory, in terms of print culture, both Black and white abolitionists, men and women, were very prominent in spreading that message. And women speaking out in public, like Maria Stewart or the Grimke sisters later on, did create a controversy in 19th century America, where people felt women should not be speaking out or getting involved in public matters, and that they should be sticking to their private domestic sphere. There were other sources and other kinds of archival materials that one can look at. The anti-slavery collection in the Boston Public Library, the Samuel May collection at Cornell University. Much of it is digitized. You can still go to these places and research these topics. A lot of new material coming out on the Underground Railroad, which I call the Abolitionist Underground. That help fugitive slaves escape. And one should look at how fugitive slave abolitionism, what I call fugitive slave abolitionists, become very prominent in the movement. You know, we all now know the stories of Douglass and Harriet Tubman, or of somebody like Solomon Northup, a free Black man who was wrongfully enslaved and then wrote his narrative. But there's so many more of them. And I spent a lot of time researching their narratives and the things that they wrote, their newspapers. One of them literally wrote a newspaper called Voice of the Fugitive, or published a newspaper called Voice of the Fugitive in Canada. His name was Henry Bibb. They're remarkable stories of escape, which became very popular both in the United States and internationally. So those were the kinds of topics that I looked at. Thank you, Cheryl. Yes, it is very was an interesting topic. Yeah, the research was difficult. The resources were there, but it seemed to me that many historians had ignored it and had given us caricatured versions of that. And I found just going back to the archives, even though there was this vast secondary literature on abolition, all of which I read, I found it was really important for me to actually go back to the sources and get a real understanding of the movement. Here's another question. Where can I purchase a copy of the book? You can purchase it on Amazon. It's available in paperback, in Kindle, in and an audiobook too. I would recommend a paperback because you can see the illustrations really well. You can also go to the website of Yale University Press and type in the title, The Slave's Cause, and you will immediately get all the reviews of the book from all the newspapers, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Literacy Supplement. All of them are there. You will get also a list of the awards and the honors that the book has won. When I wrote the book, I was nervous that no one would read it because it was long, and that most historians won't like it because I was pretty much arguing against everything they had said about the abolition movement. Except for some really valuable work done on African American abolitionists and on women abolitionists in the recent years. Much of the work on the movement as a whole, I thought, was a caricature. So I was pleased that the book got a good reception. Here's a very good question. Roughly what percentage of Americans supported the abolition movement? Well, we know, as I write in the book, that there were at least 100 to 200,000 dues-paying members and subscribers to abolitionist societies and newspapers, but many more were what I would call fellow travelers. They would actually sign on petitions, abolitionist petitions, for specific things against the annexation of Texas, against the Mexican War as a land grab for slavery, or they would sign petitions to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. So if you take into account all that, and then you end up with the number of northern white male citizens, because they were the only ones who could vote, except for a few blacks in New England or those who met property holding qualifications in states like New York. We know that the majority that voted Abraham Lincoln into office in 1860, that majority had been influenced and really the ground had been laid for that by the abolition movement. Without that 30-year effort by the abolition movement, you wouldn't get that northern anti-slavery majority in the presidential elections of 1860. So yeah, who were the abolitionists? I would say definitely those who were in the movement as activists, but we should think of it as larger and larger circles of influence that really they managed to get their message out to the average northern anti-slavery voter. And that's why I argue that the abolitionist movement was politically significant, and that to draw a distinction between political parties and the social movement is wrong-headed, because the movement is what creates the ground for the emergence of a third party, the Republican Party of the 1850s, not to be confused with the party today, because in the 19th century, the Republican Party was the party of anti-slavery liberalism. The Democratic Party was the party of slaveholders and of white supremacy through much of the 19th century. I can see that Nicole has actually in the chat box put in a link to the Yale University Press site where you are able to purchase that book. So thank you, Nicole Carpenter. I also thank Nicole Carpenter for arranging this book chat through Westport Museum. I would encourage everyone also to, you can't visit the museum physically as I did a year ago. It's a wonderful resource for Westport and Connecticut, and for any visitors from the country. But you can visit the site virtually. Besides the live chats, you can see some of their archived videos in the YouTube links that they have posted. So that was the process. There is another question here about how difficult it was to do the research on the book. Yeah, it was it was a tough going for me for 10 years. But I kept at it, and I feel as if you do something that you feel really passionately about, whether the rewards in the end are there or not becomes immaterial. You derive a lot of satisfaction just writing the book. Here's another comment about Elihu Burritt, and I'm really glad that somebody mentioned him, that he visited Westport. Burritt was a pacifist and an abolitionist. He believed in what he called compensated emancipation. He wanted to avoid war by compensating slaveholders for their slave property. This is something that the British had done when they abolished slavery in the 1830s. But Garrison rejected that, and most African Americans did. They felt that if anyone deserved compensation, it was the enslaved for years of unpaid labor. And Burritt, in the end, separated a little bit from the abolition movement because of that. There were a lot of pacifists who were abolitionists, and then the Civil War broke out. Many abolitionists valued their abolitionism higher than their pacifism, like Garrison. And there were a few pacifists who felt they could not support the war, even though it was a war against slavery. There's one of them, Joseph Blanchard, who took that stance. There were others who took that stance, but they ended up during the war, helping freed people and fugitive slaves. So they didn't completely give up their anti-slavery principles. Um, Thank you, Sarah, for tuning in. And I know I try to pack in a lot of information in this half-hour talk. I I will, try to do that as much as possible, even when I'm lecturing with my students, because there's so much history, and that's why I guess this book is somewhat large, but a lot of it is footnotes and illustrations and front matter too. But yeah, that's what I did. Julia, can we talk here? Yes, I'll be willing to stay on. We have finished our half hour time slot. So those who have to go, yes, I understand, but I'll be happy, Julia, to stay on for a few more minutes if you have other questions. Like many of you, I have nowhere to go. I am pretty much bound to my home office, which you are seeing here, and my desk and my computer, writing this new book on Reconstruction after the Civil War and what happened to the abolitionist project after the Civil War. So I am pretty much here. If you have any more questions, I'll be happy to address them. You can type your question here, Julia. Go ahead. I'll be right here. And if not, I will end the session by thanking all of you for joining me, for joining the Westport Historical Museum. I again thank Nicole Carpenter for arranging this whole thing. I have never done a Facebook live stream thing, as my son often tells me. I'm a bit of a Luddite. Here are some great questions and comments from teachers across the country who are doing wonderful work, doing all their lessons online in our national emergency. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, Georgette. Thank you. Sarah, yes, do send me the cartoons. I am looking for more illustrations for my Reconstruction book that I am wrapping up, which is under contract with Live Right, Norton imprint, which hopefully will be done in the next year. So look out for that. And so, yes, if you have any great cartoons from the Library of Congress, Sarah, I would love to get it. Thank you, Ada. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for your comments here too. Julia, are you talking about John F. Kennedy, or are you talking about an abolitionist here? I am not sure, but I will leave the Kennedy question to experts, but I will say that there were, in fact, a lot of abolitionists who were imprisoned, and some of them, in fact, died well before the Civil War in the war against slavery. The most famous, of course, is John Brown, but there were others who were imprisoned for assisting fugitive slaves, and some of them actually died in prison. All right. Thank you, Sarah. That's helpful. I'm trying to be conscientious in addressing all your comments here. It's sometimes difficult to keep up with it because there's so many appearing simultaneously. But I think that is pretty much it for the questions. As far as I can see, I have addressed all of them, and I see that we are now 5 minutes above our half hour allotment. So I will wish you well and tell you all to stay safe and stay strong. I think reading about the abolitionists at this moment might be inspirational, because when we think that things are really bad, things have been worse, and we have, as a nation, overcome that. And I think it is important, in fact, to draw on those traditions of resistance and courage at this moment. So thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining me. Thanks again. And I would like to end this now. Bye bye.